I rise to speak about the humanitarian crisis that is at our southern border right now. We are living through a moment in history when we are literally sending babies and toddlers into detention camps. Think about that, Mr. President. Think about what I just said. Our federal government is sending babies and toddlers to detention camps. It's immoral. It's wrong. The AP broke a story last night that left me speechless. And I want the details of this horror recorded and documented in the official Senate record so that Americans years from now will look back on us. They will see how wrong we were. So I will read this article from the Associated Press called, quote, "Youngest Migrants Held in, quote, Tender Age Shelters," end of quote. It's by Garance Burke and Martha Mendoza. Quote, "Trump administration officials have been sending babies and other young children forcibly separated from their parents at the U.S.-Mexican border to at least 3, quote, tender age shelters in South Texas," the Associated Press has learned. Lawyers and medical providers who have visited the Rio Grande Valley shelters described playrooms of crying preschool-age children in crisis. The government also plans to open a 4th shelter to house hundreds of young migrant children in Houston, where city leaders denounced the move Tuesday. Since the White House announced its zero-tolerance policy in early May, more than 23,000 children have been taken from their parents at the U.S.-Mexican border, resulting in a new influx of young children requiring government care. The government has faced withering critiques over images of some of the children in cages inside U.S. Border Patrol processing stations. Decades after the nation's child welfare system ended the use of orphanages over concerns about the lasting trauma to children, the administration is starting up new institutions to hold Central American toddlers that the government separated from their parents. The thought that they are going to be putting such little kids in an institutional setting, I mean, it's hard for me even to wrap my mind around it, said Kay Beller, Vice President for Programs at Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service, which provides foster care and other child welfare services to migrant children. Quote, "Toddlers are being detained." Beller said shelters follow strict procedures surrounding who can gain access to the children in order to protect their safety, but that means information about their welfare can be limited. By law, child migrants traveling alone must be sent to facilities run by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services within 3 days of being detained. The agency then is responsible for placing the children in shelters or foster homes until they are united with a relative or sponsor in the community as they await their immigration court hearings. But U.S. Attorney General Jeff Sessions' announcement last month that the government would criminally prosecute everyone who crosses the U.S.-Mexican border illegally has led to the breakup of families, of migrant families, and sent to a new group of hundreds of young children into the government's care. The United Nations, some Democratic and Republican lawmaker and religious groups have sharply criticized the policy, calling it inhumane. Not so, said Steve Wagner, an official with the Department of Health and Human Services, quote, "We have specialized facilities that are devoted to providing care to children with special needs and tender-aged children, as we define as under 13 would fall in that category," he said. Quote, "They are not government facilities per se, and they have very well-trained clinicians, and those facilities meet state licensing standards for child welfare agencies, and they're staffed by people who know how to deal with the needs, particularly of younger children. Until now, however, it's been unknown where they are. Quote, in general, we do not identify the locations of permanent unaccompanied alien children program facilities, said agency spokesman Kenneth Wolf. The 3 centers in Combs, Raymondville, and Brownsville have been rapidly repurposed to serve the needs of children, including some under 5. A fourth, planned for Houston, would house up to 240 children in a warehouse previously used for people displaced by Hurricane Harvey, Mayor Sylvester Turner said. Turner said he met with officials from Austin-based Southwest Key Programs, the contractor that operates some of the child shelters, to ask them to reconsider their plans. A spokeswoman for Southwest Key didn't immediately reply to an email seeking comment. Quote, "And so there comes a point in time we draw a line. And for me, the line is with these children," Turner said during a news conference Tuesday. On a practical level, the zero-tolerance policy was overwhelmed by the federal agencies charged with caring for the new influx of children who tend to be much younger than teens who typically have been traveling to the U.S. alone. Indeed, some recent detainees are infants taken from their mothers. Doctors and lawyers who have visited the shelter said the facilities are fine, clean and safe, but the kids, who have no idea where their parents are, were hysterical, crying, and acting out. Quote, "The shelters aren't the problem. It's taking kids from their parents that's the problem," said South Texas pediatrician Marcia Griffin, who has visited many. Alicia Lieberman, who runs the Early Trauma Treatment Network at University of California, San Francisco, said decades of studies show early separations can cause permanent emotional damage. Quote, "Children are biologically programmed to grow best in the care of a parent figure. When that bond is broken through long and unexpected separations with no set timeline for reunion, children respond at the deepest psychological and emotional levels," she said. "Their fear triggers a flood of stress hormones that disrupt neural circuits in the brain, create high levels of anxiety, make them more susceptible to physical and emotional illness, and damage their capacity to manage their emotions, trust people, and focus their attention on age-appropriate activities." Days after Sessions announced the zero-tolerance policy, the government issued a call for proposals from shelter and foster care providers to provide services for the new influx of children taken from their families after journeying from Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Mexico. As children are separated from their families, law enforcement agents reclassify them from members of family units to, quote, "unaccompanied alien children." Federal officials said Tuesday that since May, they have separated 2,342 children from their families, rendering them unaccompanied minors in the government's care. While Mexico is still the most common country of origin for families arrested at the border, in the last 8 months, Honduras has become the fastest growing category as compared to fiscal year 2017. During a press briefing on Tuesday, reporters repeatedly asked for an age breakdown of the children who have been taken. Officials from both law enforcement and Health and Human Services said they didn't know how many children were under 5, under 2, or even so little they're nonverbal. Quote, "The facilities that they have, for the most part, are not licensed for tender-age children," said Michelle Brain, Director of Migrant Rights at the Women's Refugee Commission, who met with a 4-year-old girl in diapers in McAllen Warehouse, where Border Patrol temporarily holds migrant families. Quote, "There is no model for how you house tons of little children in cots institutionally in this country. We don't do orphanages. Our child welfare has recognized that this is an inappropriate setting for little children. So now the government has to try to hire more caregivers. The recent call for proposals by the federal government's Office of Refugee Resettlement said it was seeking applicants who can provide services for a diverse population, quote, of all ages and genders, as well as pregnant and parenting teens. Even the policy surrounding what age to take away a baby is inconsistent. Customs and Border Protection field chiefs over all 9 Southwest border districts can use their discretion over how young is too young, officials said. And while Health and Human Services defines tender age typically as 12 and under, Customs and Border Protection has at times defined it as 5 and under. For 30 years, Los Fresno, Texas-based International Education Services ran emergency shelters and foster care programs for younger children and pregnant teens who arrived into the U.S. as unaccompanied minors. At least one resident sued for the right to have an abortion in a high-profile case last March. For reasons this agency did not explain, 3 months ago, the government's Refugee Resettlement Office said it was ending their funding to the program and transferred all children to other facilities. This came weeks before the administration began its zero-tolerance policy, prompting a surge in tender-age migrant children needing shelter. In recent days, members of Congress have been visiting the shelters and processing centers or watching news reports about them, bearing witness to the growing chaos. In a letter sent to Attorney General Jeff Sessions on Tuesday, a dozen Republican senators said, separating families isn't consistent with American values and ordinary human decency. On Monday, a Guatemalan mother who hasn't seen her 7-year-old son since he was taken from her a month ago sued the Trump administration. Beata Mariana de Jesus Mejia was released from custody while her asylum case is pending and thinks her son Darwin might be in a shelter in Arizona. Quote, "I only got to talk to him once, and he sounded so sad. My son never used to sound like that. He was such a dynamic boy." Mejia said as she wept, I call, and no one will tell me where he is." End of article. Mr. President, you have young children. I have young children. I am certain you cannot imagine how horrific it would be for you to give up your child into the hands of someone you don't know, and you don't know where they will take him or her. I am certain you can't imagine that pain and horror. This body should not allow it. We should stand against it. It is morally wrong, it is outrageous, and it must end. I yield the floor.